was ein tief auf wie agiti las Hashems was ein tief auf wie agiti las Open up your lips and my mouth shall declare your praise. Open up my lips and my mouth shall declare your praise. Sea to shining sea, oh, eh, eh. Searching for me, yeah. Searching for me, but you won't find me. All across the land, oh, yeah. We've been digging up some sand, yeah. Oh, we've been digging up some sand. With us up in skin with them for win. Dispatch the troops and out the captain. My jam is held captive in the dungeon. Don't come back again till you end the mission. If it takes a long time, don't lose the vision. If you're stuck, check the blueprints and look within reflection. Gotta find a rhythm. Won't you please return, child? Where you sea to shining sea, yeah. Searching for me, searching for me, but you won't find me. All across the land, oh, oh. I've been digging up some sand. I've been digging up the sand. In my night, twilight, moonlight and light in my night, at twilight. Get a bang, 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 get a bang. Place, face like a warrior slain, engraved into the space with his sword still raised. Layers of charcoal sprayed through hallways, praise relays off the walls echoing always. Dirt covered, dirt lays beneath my rib cage. Give birth to overgrowth, invading on the pathways. Dirt covered, dirt lays beneath my rib cage. Giving birth to overgrowth, invading on the pathways. Burn out trees, cover streets, children once played. So see decay through the sacred stepping stones in disarray. For the altar used to be placed, and it changed for blood stains. Sun rays illuminate the smoke-filled haze. Trace of incense and a sacrifice. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. I hope we're all doing well. I hope we all had productive weeks last week and nice weekends to rest off the busy week. Nice Shabbats if we observe Shabbat. Um, so, welcome back to those of you who were here last week, to those of you who are joining us for the first time. Thank you and welcome. Um, just briefly, my name is John Proper. I'm one of the lay people here at OneShul who uh, are behind the scenes, and this is one of the classes that I've been wanting to teach for a while. What I would like to start with, what I always start with, is for you to let me know if you can hear me and see me okay. If you've been to OneShul before, then you know the drill. Go to the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, click the orange button that says OneShul chat room, join the chat room, and join the chat room. And then just let me know if you can see and hear me okay. While you do that, I would like to mention, this was something I think I failed to mention last time, but you can actually change, for those of you who don't know how it works, you can change your username and even your picture or your avatar that shows up next to your name when you chat. So for the moment, I'm looking at the chat room and I'm seeing a lot of guests, guest 753, guest 774, guest 140. It would be very beneficial to me so that I can tell the difference between your questions and comments and make sure I'm responding to everyone. If you would click the button at the bottom right hand of the screen next to the yellow button or the orange button that says menu, and change your username. Give yourself either a first name or a nickname, something that I can call you other than guest 774 or 753. It will make the process much, much easier for me tonight so that I can sort through your comments and your questions more quickly. I see we have some people joining us in the chat room now. Feel free, the rest of you who are hanging around the group chats menu, to join us in the chat room. While I wait for feedback on that, I think I'll go ahead and take care of some of the standard business that we like to always address here at OneShul. First of all, just to remind you that OneShul is led by people like me, which is to say lay people, not necessarily people who are professional scholars. I mean, certainly we have rabbis and people who would describe themselves as scholars who are behind the scenes at OneShul, who are happy to lead services or lead a class. But OneShul is ultimately about you and about folks like me who are just passionate about Judaism and want to learn alongside other people on Jewish topics. So I mention that because we are not for profit, and if and when possible, we like to ask for a donation. No pressure if you can't do it. I don't want to guilt you. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. I only mention it because we don't make any money behind the scenes in terms of, I don't get paid for teaching a class or anything like that. It's just to keep OneShul running so we can broadcast every month. So if you can donate something like the price of a cup of coffee, I always like to mention that those donations are welcome. Of course, part of what makes a community great, though, is the people. And even if we had the donations necessary to keep OneShul going month after month after month, if all the people disappeared because they were tired of being hounded, then we wouldn't have much of a community. So you're welcome here no matter what you can offer in terms of donations. We want your conversation. We want your feedback. I'm seeing some people have joined in, and I'll be responding to you as you join in on the chat room. Just a reminder for newcomers, There's about a 15-second delay from when I say something to when you receive it, or thereabouts. I tested it last week. So if you send something to me and I don't immediately respond in the video, I'm not ignoring you. There's just a delay. I mean, it's possible that I haven't seen it, but I'll try to respond to everything in a timely manner, and I just appreciate your patience with that delay. So now that we have now that we've taken care of some of those introductions, what I'd like to do is on the chat room, you will very shortly see the PDF for tonight's class. I want you to feel free to download that and refer to that as we go through the evening. If you were not here with us last week, you'll notice that I'm skipping over some pages. It's because we covered those last week. I'll try to let you know where we are for any newcomers as we go along. So last week when I began, one of the things that I did was recite a truncated blessing for Torah study, a customary tradition. Tonight I don't want to do that. Tonight I think that it would be remiss, even inappropriate for me to fail to mention the tragic news out of Israel this afternoon, this evening, about the 3 missing teenagers who were feared kidnapped in the West Bank, and who it appears unfortunately and tragically have been found and are no longer with us. And we of course pray that their memories are for a blessing, but we can only imagine and probably not imagine really the suffering that the families and the communities who are impacted by these young men's lives are going through. So in lieu of a traditional blessing for Torah study, I just wanted to bring that up because I feel like I feel like what we do is sacred business, going about any kind of study. Judaism traditionally teaches us that the purpose of study is to put our words and our knowledge into action. And I think that particularly tonight, when we're thinking about the instability of the Middle East and the instability of other parts of our world, even here in the United States, for those of you who are here in the States, presumably it looks like everyone here is, times are tough. And I think the beautiful thing about Judaism is that it turns something as ordinary as study into something really elevated, and inspires us to see it as part of the process of making our world a better place, so as to avoid or to prevent future tragedies like the tragedy that we've been presented with this afternoon. So I wanted to mention that in lieu of a traditional blessing, because I feel like in some sense that's blessing enough. So what I'm not going to do this week is review too much of what we talked about last week, because there's another class or another group that meets at 8 o'clock, and I don't want to bleed over into their time, and we have a bit of ground to cover tonight. So instead, what I thought I would do is simply review my definition of philosophy, because that's the subject of this class, Jewish philosophy after the Holocaust. Define what I mean by that, just to sort of jog your memories, and then explain again briefly in a sentence or two why I think the Holocaust is a relevant subject, or that the years after the Holocaust is a relevant subject for studying Jewish philosophy. So the definition that I use, I actually take from Merriam-Webster's dictionary, which is that philosophy, it's sort of 2 parts. The first is that philosophy is the study of ideas about knowledge, truth, the nature and meaning of life, and so on. The second part of that definition is philosophy is a set of ideas about how to do something or how to live. So the first definition, like I said last week, is more abstract, more academic perhaps, and the second might be more personal, might have more to do with you and your particular set of ideas and how it informs your worldview, but also your everyday life. So when I talk about Jewish philosophy, then I'm talking about those things, all the things that I just mentioned, but in the context of Jewish people, in the context of Jewish history, in the context of Jewish culture and traditions, and symbols and concepts, to draw meaning from what it means to be a Jew, from Jewish identity, and from Judaism as a faith. The reason I wanted to concentrate on Jewish philosophy after the Holocaust, as opposed to other points in Jewish history, is because I feel like the Holocaust's changes in how we think as Jews and how we think as communities, and really how the world thinks about the nature of tragedy and genocide. The Holocaust is a cultural marker educationally for Jews and non-Jews for us to sort of grapple with, and all of its ramifications and the questions that it raises. But especially for Jews, you know, the 6 million Jewish lives lost, and may their memories be for a blessing. In some sense, their memories carry on as we continue to do study to try to come to grips with what it means now to be a survivor or to be someone who's carrying the legacy of the Jewish people in your daily life. And so I think the changes in thinking brought about by the Holocaust were especially relevant to the way that we do Judaism in the here and now. And so my goal was for you to be able to meet some philosophers, or introduce you to some philosophers and to some philosophers' ideas, and then hopefully help you pick out when you see their influence in your own Jewish experiences. If you did not come last week, that's perfectly fine. We have a video online of the event, and I refer you back to that video because there's a lot of ground we covered that I won't be able to cover tonight. The first philosopher that we looked at last week was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who is of course, a well-known Jewish philosopher and rabbi. So if that's something that's of interest to you, I encourage you to go back to that earlier video. So before I give a biography, a brief bio of the first philosopher that we're going to look at tonight, I want to ask if anyone knows or recognizes the name. The first philosopher we're going to look at tonight is Rabbi Emil Fackenheim, who is probably best known for a concept called the 614th commandment. So if you know anything about Rabbi Fackenheim, or you've heard of the 614th commandment, you say, wait, I thought there were traditionally 613 commandments found in the Torah that God gives to the Hebrews, to the Jews. What's this 614th? What's this additional commandment? And who is this Rabbi Fackenheim to propose another commandment? We'll talk a little bit about that. So if you know anything about him, I encourage you to mention it in the chat room. I'd love to see what you have to say. So a brief bio of Fackenheim. Fackenheim was the author of a number of philosophical works. And if you're looking for the page that we're on, there's actually a picture of Rabbi Fackenheim, very long, large beard, several pages into the document. Next, so anyway, Rabbi Fackenheim was the author of a number of philosophical texts on Judaism and was a PhD in philosophy. He taught for a number of years at his alma mater, which was the University of Toronto. Rabbi Fackenheim was ordained in the Reform tradition. I tried to focus on picking 3 different rabbis who represented different viewpoints. So last week we looked at Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was technically both an Orthodox ordained rabbi and a liberal ordained rabbi, but tended to lean more toward very conservative Judaism, or sort of liberal Orthodox Judaism. Tonight we'll look first at Rabbi Fackenheim, who represents really a solidly Reform perspective on Judaism. And then we'll also look at another rabbi who represents what I think is more of a moderate conservative position. Okay, so what I used last week as guidelines for us to approach some main points of these philosophers' works was what I called the 4 questions. I looked at 4 questions that each of these philosophers attempt to address, and then we sort of compare and contrast how they address these questions differently. So the first question is there a God? For Fackenheim, he acknowledges that belief in God is central to Judaism. Unlike some Jewish philosophers, Fackenheim does not want to shrink away from the fact that God is of central importance to at least his understanding of what it means to be Jewish and to have a Jewish faith. At the same time, Fackenheim is very careful. Unlike, by comparison, say, Rabbi Heschel that we studied last week, for whom God is a given, philosophically a given. He can't necessarily be proven rationally, but much of Heschel's philosophy depends on this assumption that there is a God, and understanding Heschel's philosophy is in part first understanding that he holds this belief so essential. For Rabbi Fackenheim, however, while he believes in God, he professes faith in God, he acknowledges that we can't necessarily prove God's existence, and he also acknowledges that in the modern world, especially among Jews, there is a trend toward Jewish agnosticism, which is to say doubt about God's existence, or lack of existence, or Jewish atheism, which Fackenheim doesn't want to condemn outright. He has issues with it, but he doesn't want to say that believing or not believing in God is the only thing that makes you a good person. So Fackenheim looks at, well, what does it mean to believe in God? In Fackenheim's mind, belief in God comes from someone who, and this is a phrase he refers to a lot throughout his work, one who is open to the prospect of faith or to the prospect of belief, which is to say you have doubts and you entertain them and you explore them, but you also allow for the possibility of God, and that we never, as Jews, even if we find ourselves not believing, that we never totally abandon the idea of God. It's simply too central, even in our doubts, even with our lack of proof. And Fackenheim makes it very clear he believes in a modern world we have much harder standards or higher standards for proving God's existence than what might have once passed muster in the ancient world or in the pre-modern world. So in short, yes, Fackenheim believes in God, but he also doesn't assume that that's the end-all be-all. For him, belief in God is symbolic of a much larger project of being, and this is the category that I sort of lump Fackenheim into. Remember, I said I would try to describe three central ways of thinking. The first last week was Heschel's, which was the activist mystic. This week, I would say Fackenheim falls into a category I describe as the rational optimist, someone willing to acknowledge that perhaps their beliefs are based not on facts, but on faith, while at the same time choosing to hold out hope that they are true because of the merits that they provide, as well as what it does for the soul, or what he believes it does for the soul. So the second question is, why do human beings suffer? Fackenheim is very, because he leaves open the possibility that many modern Jews are never going to believe in God in this sort of traditional way, or perhaps won't believe in any God. He wants to avoid saying that evil is necessarily the result of disobedience to God. Heschel describes evil as the thing that happens when humans disobey God. Fackenheim wants to say, I don't want to over-describe what I believe evil is. Is it a force? Is it a choice? Is it a description? Is it an adjective? Is it a category? What I know is it's a reality, right? And so for Fackenheim, it's sort of less important that we quantify it in terms of metaphysics, like how does this fit into the wider world, or the sort of the universe, and simply acknowledge human beings suffer. And they frequently appear to suffer because of what other human beings do to them. At the same time, Fackenheim wants to, because he is the rational optimist and he chooses to believe in God, he wants to say that pain is a factor in our existence, but that perhaps there is a meaning and a purpose and an ultimate reason for it all. And that's where that optimism comes in. That's where that one who leaves themselves open to faith, that description that he uses, one who leaves themselves open to faith, comes up again and again for Fackenheim. So why do human beings suffer? We suffer because other human beings cause us to suffer, or because we do things to harm ourselves, or because our environment is hostile to us, but perhaps there is an ultimate meaning or purpose in it that we have yet to see. And he isn't saying that for sure, but he chooses to sort of look at it that way, and he presents that as a possibility. Just a moment, I am responding to some comments. Okay, so the third question that Fackenheim wants to answer is, how should we live? one of the things that I want to point out is that actually all of the Jewish philosophers that we're looking at, they tend to disagree with each other in pretty radical ways, but all three of them really kind of come together on this point. Number three is, how should we live? Question number three is something that tends to bring everyone together. For whatever reason, I think because of this sort of shared Jewish values. Fackenheim has sort of two answers. The first answer is directed at people in general, and the second answer is directed sort of at Jews in particular, and I'll look at that one when we sort of look at question number 4. But for people in general, how should we live? We should acknowledge that suffering is a reality as a result of evil, and that evil often comes about as a result of our inability to recognize the dignity of another person. So does it matter if evil is a force or a being or simply a choice? Ultimately, there seems to be a cause and effect relationship between human action and the experience of the effect of evil. And so in Fackenheim's mind, just like in the mind of Heschel, just like in the mind of the third rabbi we're going to look at later this evening, we have a responsibility as human beings, not only as Jews, but for all people, to parse out ethics as we understand them, according to the values of our culture, of course, but to attempt to reduce suffering when we see it, and to find ways and develop strategies for doing that. And this is something that all of these philosophers share, even though they disagree on everything from the existence of God to where evil comes from and why we suffer, and philosophically come from very different camps. They all seem to agree that, like, ultimately, if we're boiling it down to its bare essentials, there's something fundamentally, necessary about reducing suffering when we encounter it. That is both essential to being a Jew, but also essential to being a full human being. So the last question then for Fackenheim is, what does it mean to be a Jew? Which I said that I would address almost as kind of part of part 3, an extension of question 3, how should we live? So Fackenheim, like I said before, has a response for everybody in general. Now he wants to direct his attention to Jews in particular. And this is where this whole 614th mitzvah, or commandment, comes from. Traditional Judaism says that God gave so many commandments, do this, don't do that, to the Jews of the Torah, the ancient Hebrews. And there were a number of rabbis and ancient scholars who essentially went through the Torah piece by piece and attempted to count all of the different do this and don't do that God offers. And the ultimate conclusion was actually there were different numbers. There were a number of different, I think it's this many numbers, I think it's this many numbers, I think it's, ultimately, I think the most popular was 613. That's the one that we tend to defer to now. That traditionally there are 613 commandments that God gives us in the Torah. Fackenheim says, what does it mean to be a Jew? Well, the first thing is to follow this 614th commandment. Now, Fackenheim is a Reform rabbi. Reform rabbis do not believe that those 613, or however many you count them, those commandments found in the Torah are necessarily binding on contemporary Jews today. They don't see that body of tradition as law so much as guideline or tradition, something that we refer to, something that we appropriate, something that we use, something that we are inspired by and draw upon, but not necessarily something that we feel bound to. And particularly, again, because Fackenheim believes that many Jews are righteous Jews without believing in God, he doesn't want to necessarily say you have to follow these commandments, because with that comes this kind of assumption that you have to believe in the God that gave those commandments. Either that, or you're just sort of following blindly where you're told to go because you're told it's the right thing to do by somebody, presumably in your community. And Fackenheim wants to avoid all of that. So he says, well, no, as a Reform rabbi, I don't believe that you have to follow all of the commandments. But were I going to add a commandment of my own to the sort of traditional body of things we must do as Jews, something we should all be beholden to as Jews is, do not let Hitler, in essence, do not let Hitler have a posthumous victory. Do not let the Holocaust and the tragedy of the Holocaust stop the Jewish people from existing at some point in the future. And remembering too that Fackenheim lived, he passed away in 2003, but lived in this era and survived this era, it means that it was foremost in his mind Jewish survival, even more so to a certain extent than, well, not necessarily more so, but certainly it was foremost in his mind that Jews should continue to survive even if we don't agree about like the existence of God or whatever. So that's important to keep in mind. That for him, the 614th commandment, and this is something he's been sort of criticized for by some rabbis, I think ultimately it's something that has been sort of overemphasized in his philosophy, and I don't want to overplay it. This idea that Jews who exist now after the Holocaust have to somehow be beholden to the legacy of the Holocaust, have to carry that on their shoulders for all time, simply to avoid giving Hitler some kind of victory from the grave. That's definitely like problematic for some people. I don't think that Fackenheim is trying to say we should burden ourselves with the legacy of the Holocaust insofar as it drowns out all other aspects of Judaism. I just think he's saying, in whatever way we survive, so long as we are maintaining the core values of Judaism, going back to part 3, how should we live? Even if our beliefs aren't the same, the Jewish people should thrive. And so that's sort of ultimately what he's talking about there. So if you have any questions about those 4 points, let me review them. And then we're going to move on to the last philosopher that we're going to examine, the third philosopher. Let me just review these, and if you have any questions, say so in the chat room. I'm happy to go over them with you later. I noticed that someone came in just a moment ago. If there's anything you missed, I'm happy to give you my email and or have you catch up on the video at some point later, and we can discuss this over email if there's something you missed and you do want to have a conversation about. But anyway, the 4 questions as presented by Fackenheim: is there a God? He believes yes. He believes it's the goal, ideally, of every Jew and every human being to hope and aspire belief in God, but not necessarily achieve belief in God. And he doesn't equate belief in God with being a good person necessarily. Why do human beings suffer? Because evil is a reality. Do we know exactly what evil is, where it comes from? Not exactly, but we do connect it to choices that human beings make and how they perpetuate injustices on each other, at least in part. And that is partially where suffering comes from. The third question, how should we live? Fackenheim says, first of all, if you aren't a Jew, or if you are a Jew, it doesn't make any difference. It's our job to parse out ethics according to the values of our culture, to identify suffering, which is the symptom of evil in the world, and reduce it. He uses the word redemption a lot. We have to work as partners with God, this God that he aspires to believe in and that he's very optimistic exists. We have to believe in this God or aspire to, and as part of that, we should be partners with God in living ethically. And if we can't believe in this God, then we should at least do the ethics because they're sort of self-evident in terms of their value. And what does it mean to be a Jew? I think summarizing that would be survival, but also survival while keeping the fundamental values, that commitment to ethics, that commitment to engagement, that commitment to compassion, versus necessarily the law or traditional sort of, the Torah laws, the 613 commandments. And he revises that by saying, I add an additional commandment: we must also survive. And that's very important to him. So we will move on then. Hold on a second, I think I got a chat. Yes, someone just asked if this video will be posted like the last one. Yes, this one should go up tomorrow. Okay, so the next philosopher that we're going to look at, and the last of the 3 philosophers that we've looked at for this course, is Richard L. Rubinstein, Rabbi Richard L. Rubinstein. He's the author of After Auschwitz. The subtitle of that book is History, Theology, and Contemporary Judaism, as well as The Cunning of History, the Holocaust and the American Future. Rubinstein, like Fackenheim, is different from Heschel in that Heschel wanted to write more broadly about Judaism as a sort of eternal faith. And when he responded to questions raised by the Holocaust, he did so insofar as they were perhaps connected to wider ethical questions that Judaism wishes to address in general. Fackenheim and Rubinstein, on the other hand, really want to look at the Holocaust. I mean, Fackenheim responds directly to the problem of evil as presented in the Holocaust by addressing that it's perhaps hard for us to believe like we used to. And Rubinstein offers a similar approach. And so these two philosophers really wanted to represent or reframe Judaism in a meaningful way, given the suffering of the Holocaust and the questions it raises. So Rubinstein is a PhD graduate of Harvard. And he's probably best known, and this is what we're going to look at tonight, his rather controversial philosophical idea, which was actually something that he sort of latched onto by extension of something that was going on in Christianity, actually, at the time, Protestant Christianity, which is this movement in philosophy called the death of God. And I want to be careful in terms of how I frame this, because I don't want to offend anyone, but I also want to be very clear in terms of my understanding of Rubinstein's ideas. Again, I'm presenting my interpretation, but I'm trying to be as objective as possible, and I'm open to conversations about that if you have different interpretations. But Rubinstein was ordained as a rabbi in the conservative tradition, so JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary. And he's still writing today. He's actually, of the three philosophers that, and the three rabbis that we've looked at, Rubinstein is still with us and is still writing today. So Rubinstein is an interesting guy. This sort of death of God theology is interesting business. And I want to unpack it as carefully as possible, realizing that I can only do it so much justice in, 15, 20 minutes. So, what does he mean when he says God is dead, or it is as if God has died? Because that's his premise, right? It is as if God has died, the death of God, and where do we go from here? What he's referring to is this idea that we can no longer, given the violence and the suffering and the misery of the Holocaust, as well as other injustices perpetuated throughout the world, as modern scientific rational minds, we can no longer assume that the old image of God as kind of grandfather karma, right? God, the old guy on a beard sitting on a throne, who rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked, and it's all very black and white, and the good get what they deserve and the evil get what they deserve, and it's very clear and clean cut. Rubinstein says, as modern people, given the suffering we've seen, not that it's anything new, but given that we're really fully aware of it and we have the tools of the Enlightenment around us, we can't really accept that God is real. Not because we can necessarily prove he doesn't exist. Rubinstein is not an atheist, by the way. He's not saying there is no God. What he's saying is this old idea of God is functionally dead insofar as it doesn't actually matter if that God exists somewhere out in the universe. Because at the end of the day, despite what the Torah tells us, that the righteous will always be rewarded and the wicked will always be punished, we don't live in that kind of world. That essentially that God who is sort of grandfather karma, doesn't exist in our practical lives. And so even if the inspiration, even if the source of those scriptures does exist out there, which we can't prove one way or the other, according to Rubinstein, necessarily, even if there is an existing being out there somewhere that sort of inspired those scriptures, that being is clearly not that engaged in righting wrongs in the same way that the Torah sort of describes. So in that sense, Rubinstein is saying it's as if our old pictures of God have died, not so much that there is no God, that he's an atheist. He's not saying that. So Rubinstein looks at the second question: why do human beings suffer? And like Heschel, interestingly enough, despite the fact that they're, for Heschel, the sort of traditional God of Judaism still, for the most part, works. And he doesn't make too many additions or changes or alter the definition of God as presented in the Torah too much. He refers to the Torah a lot in describing God, and he, Heschel, that is, refers to God in very mystical terms. Rubinstein, interestingly enough, has something in common with Heschel in that he also draws on mystical traditions, and he also agrees with Heschel that evil is the result of human choices, that it really does us no good to think of evil as the result of some kind of force, or the devil, or Satan, or whatever, or bad angels, or spirits, or whatever. It's simply the result of people making choices that have consequences for other people, or for themselves, that are perhaps less than healthy. And so Heschel, there is a slight difference there. Heschel says we make choices, and if we obey God, we perpetuate good. If we obey, or if we disobey God, we perpetuate evil. That is not what Rubinstein is saying. Rubinstein is not talking in terms of obedience to the old picture of God, because that's something that Heschel might be more comfortable with, but Rubinstein says is sort of problematic. Rubinstein would just say, no, it's not metaphysical. It's not about obedience or disobedience to God, particularly since we're sort of doing away with that old definition or that old picture. No, it's simply about human choice, and humans make choices that potentially harm other human beings. Like Heschel, because he draws on the idea of choice, and like Fackenheim actually also, this idea that how should we live, question number 3, really boils down to, well, we should see suffering and we should reduce it when possible. And we do it Jewishly. As Jews, we use our traditions and our customs to inspire us to do that. And it's also worth mentioning that as a conservative rabbi, Rabbi Rubinstein is perhaps opposed to Rabbi Fackenheim, at least in terms of ideology. Rabbi Fackenheim would say we don't necessarily keep the law. Rabbi Rubinstein isn't saying we don't keep the law. He's simply saying we perhaps revise our perception of God, but we keep acting ethically, and we keep doing traditional, we keep doing Judaism. And so, yeah, so there was a quote that Rubinstein writes that I thought was worth bringing up. Rubinstein says, "The unremitting ethical rationalism of this system," so the system of the law, he's referring specifically to the Torah and sort of the promises that God makes and has the people of Israel make with him, the unremitting ethical rationalism of this system is also manifested in the fact that neither at Sinai nor at Shechem do we find even a hint of or that is like supernatural, suprahuman power, such as Satan, moving Israel to disobedience. Instead, Israel's disobedience is seen as freely chosen. So what he wants to say then is, if evil is the product of choices which cause suffering, then how should we live? We should reduce suffering, because in essence that is cleaning up the streets, man. That is taking evil and putting it down a peg, bringing it down a notch. It's not about Satan, it's not about the devil, it's not about original sin, which again are more Christian concepts than Jewish concepts, but Heschel does at least ascribe to the fact that there is a law that is sacred because it emanates from God, and we must obey it to prevent evil from occurring. Rubinstein wants to say, no, we should just be very careful, and we should evaluate our world, and we should evaluate the choices that are presented to us, and we should make them carefully so as to reduce suffering or prevent further suffering. One of the people in the chat room just asked, does Rubinstein refrain from committing to an atheistic position simply because the existence of God can't be disproven? In other words, is he holding back from being an atheist simply because he's an agnostic? Or does he have a specific conception of God? Or is it some of both? Yeah, let's get into that. He is not an agnostic necessarily. His definition of God is very, very different, though. And ironically, he refers back to some traditional images in Jewish mysticism to ground his concept of God and sort of say, like, yeah, I know it's a radical definition of God and we're changing a lot of things, but it's also inspired by and rooted in something that came before me, which is very, you'll find within Jewish philosophy and in Judaism as a religion, a lot of what we do as Jews we like to say, like, I was part of this lineage, or I was part of maintaining this continuity. So yeah, what does he offer in sort of opposition to his kind of old definition of God that we're doing away with, or is functionally dead? He refers to this Hasidic, or this Kabbalistic concept, this Jewish mystical concept of the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof essentially means uh, no end, or infinite. Sort of the thing, according to Jewish mysticism, it's sort of the thing that God is outside of our world before God is manifest in our world. In some sense, this is actually similar to Heschel. Although in Heschel's case, Heschel would say God exists outside of nature, but occasionally sort of sticks his fingers in and dabbles in our lives. Rubinstein would say, no, no, no. God is merely the power cord, the power plug, and the power outlet that drive all of the things that exist. The sum total of all the forces or force that drives or drive the continued existence of our reality. We know, or we have a conception of, an experience of, a sensory perception of existence. And so from that, we assume that there's something driving that. And that we also know that other people, we have conversations with other people, have a conception of self, have a conception of existence. We have a conception of treeness and dogness and catness and all of that stuff. Catness. Anyway, so you'll get that if you're a Hunger Games fan. Anyway, so we have this conception of things existing, but what drives the things to exist? What's the ultimate spark that moved everything? It's very sort of deist in a way, or some might say actually less deist, because deism implies a conscious God. Rubinstein would say this God is not conscious. This God does not care necessarily for the well-beings of one or more particular human beings. So the question then becomes, well, then why do we worship this God? Supposedly, and what do we mean when we say we have a covenant with this God? What do we mean even when we say the Shema? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Rubinstein would say, well, we have a covenant with God insofar as we acknowledge that life is a thing that should keep on going. That we acknowledge there's potential for goodness in life, and that life has a natural tendency to end in the short term, but in the long term, in terms of the life of the universe, keep going, and species evolve, and things keep going. Rubinstein would essentially say that, like, being in covenant with that simply is acknowledging that it's a reality and trying to perpetuate the healthy continued existence of life. And that's in some sense what it means to be a religious person, is to have a sense of awe and a sense of wonder and a sense of, not necessarily magic, but in the literal sense, but in the figurative sense, a sense of magic about the world and wanting to preserve that. And that religion inspires you to conceptualize that in a framework of traditions and symbols and all of that. And so the Ein Sof then would just be the power plug. I mean, in essence, the thing that keeps the earth going. It's very different from Heschel's God. It's very different from Fackenheim's optimistic hope for God. It is a force that is utterly indifferent to us, yet ultimately keeps driving the wheels on which life continues to turn. Not only human life, but all life. And so our awareness of it is essentially what religion is supposed to do for us. So hopefully that was a bit convoluted, but hopefully that answered your question in some meaningful way. So then I'm going to move on to the last point, and then we're going to have a couple minutes to wrap up. If you have any questions, feel free to share them in the comments. I love responding to things. So anyway, so the last question then is, what does it mean to be a Jew? I think I kind of answered that actually in your sort of how does he conceive of God. And being a Jew then, like being any kind of religious person, is to in some sense be fully aware of this source of all life, and to want to preserve life, and to preserve what we understand to be the dignity of all life, and that we do that through a particular cultural milieu that developed in the Middle East among Semitic peoples, among Hermetic peoples, and that's what it means to be a Jew. And that it's really as simple as that sort of all faiths, to a certain extent, are, ideally doing this. He's not saying that they all do. He's not saying that they all will. He's saying that ideally all faiths would sort of aspire to this kind of broader sense of universal well-being without losing the specificity of their faith. The example that he gives that I really like, there's an anecdote that he shares in an article, sort of God after the death of God, in which he says that he has a conversation with I believe like an Eastern guru or a practitioner of one of the Eastern religions, who essentially confides to him, I'm very interested in your death of God theology. It's sort of consumed your work as a philosopher. I'm very interested in that. And Rubinstein was very amiable, of course, to keep talking about the ideas. And ultimately the guru sort of says to him, well, I have to say, I both believe and don't believe in my own faith. I both hold the possibility of belief, hold the value of belief, while also being aware of the fact that belief can trap me, can dogmatize me, can shackle me, and actually cause me to perpetuate suffering. And so what I hold in my mind isn't to get rid of the doubt or to only doubt, but instead to find a balance between both believing in and not believing in your faith. And Rubinstein refers to this anecdote as kind of a meaningful example of what he's talking about when he talks about the continued perpetuation of Jewish religion. It isn't just a series of like nice, pithy sayings that that sort of sums up Judaism. It isn't simply the ethics. It is also the rituals. It is also the customs. Remember, he's a conservative rabbi, moderate conservative rabbi, so he does have an understanding of tradition and the importance of maintaining tradition in a way that is perhaps different than a perspective from like a Reform rabbi or another sect that might say, well, we're post-halakhic or we're post-Jewish law. So for Rubinstein, then, we keep tradition because it allows us to have an awareness of that Ein Sof that I was talking about, but at the same time, because we both doubt and don't doubt our faith, we allow ourselves not to be shackled by teachings that we find oppressive, because we don't see ourselves as receiving these traditions directly from a personal God who cares about us as individuals, but rather as the development of a culture, right? Because Ein Sof doesn't care about individual people necessarily, and that's why suffering is allowed to continue, because it's not Grandpa Karma sitting on a throne somewhere. It is instead the sort of life force or the life energy or the life source of everything that is, or the sum total of factors that add up to everything that is. And as a result, it can't necessarily dictate tradition to us. So we take our traditions on and we preserve them because they're valuable, not because they were given to us by God. And so I think that's sort of where Rubinstein would sort of differ from Heschel and Fackenheim, even though there are some similarities. So anyway, so that's Rubinstein. Let me sort of summarize, because I know that was a bit wordy, particularly with Rubinstein, because he tends to be a bit more abstract. So for Rubinstein, is there a God? Yes, but functionally, based on our painful experiences in the real world, it's not the God of the Torah who sort of gives out good and evil based on how we act. Instead, it's perhaps the life source of the universe, the Ein Sof, as the mystics used to describe God, the sort of thing behind the universe. But it's not necessarily something that cares about us individually. It's more broadly interested in the perpetuation, the continued existence of the universe, not necessarily the individuals on it, animals or otherwise. Why do human beings suffer? We suffer because of choices, not because of disobedience to God necessarily, but because of unawareness of dignity of life and all the problems that raises. How should we live? Well, we should, if we have the choice to commit injustice, then we should live in such a way that we reduce suffering, that we reduce injustice, that we sort of go the opposite way, because we have that capacity for choice. And lastly, what does it mean to be a Jew? It doesn't necessarily mean anymore what it used to mean, the idea that we stand in covenant with a God who takes us personally as we are and knows us intimately and we know him or her intimately. Instead, it's much more being Jewish and keeping Jewish tradition is about being fully aware of the ethical ideas and our sense of place and our sense of smallness and our sense in our sort of sense of location in the vastness of the universe, against the backdrop of this Ein Sof, and how that motivates us to act ethically. And religion sort of symbolizes that and contextualizes it and frames it in an interesting way. So that is Rubinstein. So what I want to do, because we only have a couple minutes left, first of all, I just want to thank you all for coming out. I think that last week was a bit less sort of abstract. I feel like Heschel is a bit easier to get into for newcomers to philosophy, which is why I wanted to kind of start off with him so that I could use him as a reference point this week when we got into a bit more of the sort of esoteric stuff, particularly with Rubinstein. That having been said, I am sure there are questions you have, because again, these, this is a generalization, this is an overview, this is a very broad picture, and readings and interpreting the work of these different rabbis and philosophers, which means that you may have a very different perspective, or you may not necessarily understand some of my conclusions. That's great. What I'm going to do is include my email address in the comments section so that you can email me if you have further questions. I would stay on the chat room tonight, and I will be on for another minute or two, but there's another class coming in, and I don't want to disrupt them, so I'm not going to stick around too much longer, but I will put my email in the comments. Again, just thanks for coming out. I know Monday nights, not necessarily the most exciting night of the week, just getting back into the work week and sort of the swing of things. But I appreciate you for coming out. I appreciate you for supporting OneShul. Again, OneShul is here for whatever your needs are. If you have specific things you need from us or from Jewish people all over the country and the world who use OneShul as a resource, we're here to support and help. So let us know what we can do for you. And yeah, I hope everyone has a wonderful night. And shalom. Thank you.